Hello there and welcome. My name is Kate Rogers and I am Head of Sustainability and Co-Head of Charities at Cazenove. That's an investment management firm, which means my job is to help purpose-led investors put their money to work for good. And today we're going to hear how we can create a greener and fairer economy from our 5 amazing speakers. So it's up to me to welcome you first to the York Festival Ideas 2021. As we celebrate 10 years of educating, entertaining and inspiring. This event is the third in a series of events under the theme of levelling up the economy, delivered in collaboration with the Friends Provident Foundation. Before we begin, just a few technical notes. If you're watching live, you can ask questions using the question and answer button, which should be at the bottom of your screen. This is available throughout the event, so questions can be asked at any time. Should you have any technical issues, such as loss of Wi-Fi, you can rejoin the event using the original link. And please also remember that today's event is being recorded and will be available on the festival YouTube channel after the 20th of June. Subtitles are available at this event. To turn these on or off, use the CC Live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. So, on that basis, without further ado, I would love to introduce you to our first speaker. Helen Mountford is the Vice President for Climate and Economics at World Resources Institute. Helen is also Programme Director for the New Climate Economy Project, the flagship initiative of the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate that provides independent and authoritative evidence on actions which can both strengthen economic performance and reduce the risk of dangerous climate change. Helen previously worked as Deputy Director of Environment for the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, advising governments on policy reforms and overseeing work on green fiscal reform, climate change finance and economics, fossil fuel subsidy reforms, green growth, water pricing, biodiversity, incentive measures, and economy environment outlooks and modelling. So we're bound to learn an awful lot. I will hand over now to Helen. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Kate, and it's a real pleasure to be here today with you all. Really pleased that I can join you in these discussions. COVID, as we all know, has had absolutely devastating effects globally, and it is not over yet. We've seen 3.8 million people die. We've had many that have lost their jobs, their homes, their loved ones. If there's one thing it has taught us, it is that our economies are dependent on our health, and our health is dependent on our ecosystems. We cannot have a strong economy if we don't also protect our ecosystems. Now, yesterday, there was a new report released there in the UK, which showed that the UK government has not yet invested in the right infrastructure and approaches to help communities and individuals adapt to our changing climate. That's one of the big risks, probably the largest risk we face going forward in terms of major ecosystem damage. So it's a pretty scathing report, but yet the UK is not the worst off. We've seen devastating effects of climate change in other countries around the world. Here in the US, like California, we had the worst wildfire season last year. In East Africa, massive floods affecting 9 countries last year, 700,000 people affected by that. And of course, small island states are the most vulnerable to climate impacts. So we now have a real opportunity and also a need as we come out of COVID to really build back better, including to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and to build the infrastructure that can help us be resilient to climate change and other future shocks. So how do we do this? We suggest there are 4 key principles to how we build back better. We want to build back safer, we want to build back fairer, stronger, and cleaner. If we actually combine these, we will lead to economies that are more inclusive, with more jobs, are healthier and resilient to future shocks. So governments have a great opportunity to make this shift as we come out of COVID. Thus far, governments around the world have spent about or committed about $16 trillion to COVID-related relief and to stimulus spending. So how are they doing on greening this recovery? Well, the evidence is pretty mixed. This slide shows the index of how green some of the stimulus measures are in a number of countries. And what you'll see is the green elements are where there's been green, the gray is where it's been actually pretty dirty. And on balance, many of these are more towards the dirty choices, right? That includes bailing out fossil fuel intensive industries, such as the aviation sector, the oil and gas industry, etc. The UK is on the far right side. It's one of the greener ones. The US has not been so far to date. But if President Biden actually gets his American Jobs Plan through, which is heavily focused on green infrastructure, we'll also shift up the index here. Now, while this is just a snapshot of what's happened so far, one of the things that's important is if you compare it to where we stood this time last year, we've actually been going greener in most of these countries in terms of the response to the COVID crisis, investing more and more in clean energy and public transport and restoring degraded lands. So there's a positive signal as we go through the crisis that countries are shifting towards a greener recovery. And why are they doing this? They're doing it for a very good reason. Those green investments create more jobs per dollar or pound that's invested. So on average, investments in solar, photovoltaics, and building energy efficiency and public transport, etc., can actually create more than double the jobs as the same level of investment in coal, oil, or gas. So which would you choose if you were doing stimulus investments now? We're definitely seeing a shift. And countries around the world are beginning to see this for themselves. So I want to share with you very briefly an example from Indonesia, where the Ministry of Planning has been engaged in a low carbon development initiative for a few years, with the support, funding support from the UK government, and with some technical support from my team in the World Resources Institute, our team based in Jakarta. As this slide shows, it's using the government's own economic models, more ambitious climate action, the LCDI plus scenario in this slide, more ambitious climate action will actually lead to higher economic growth for Indonesia than a business as usual growth path, and from the very first year. But of course, it is not just about economic growth. We know that's only a part of the story. The benefits would also include avoiding 40,000 deaths per year from air and water pollution by 2045, and would include many more jobs, again, starting from the first year, as well as gender and regional benefits. So these two slides are from a recent report by the Indonesian ministry published before COVID, and were used to inform their current 5-year economic development plan. But the ministry over the last few months, with our assistance and that of the UK government, has been rerunning these scenarios to see what happens after the COVID economic shock is included, and with even more ambitious climate targets, aiming for net zero emissions by 2050 or 2060. Again, the evidence is very clear. More ambition on climate will actually lead to a better economy and better growth prospects for people in Indonesia, more jobs, better health, etc. So the government's now actively discussing how they'll reflect this in their climate targets. We're very much hoping that they, like many others, will step up and join the wave of those committing to net zero emissions before the climate conference in Glasgow this November. This is all part of the race to zero, where we've already seen countries responsible for well over half of global emissions commit to net zero pathways and trajectories. About 1,500 major companies have committed to set their own targets aligned with the science, and 160 banks, asset managers, and asset owners, together responsible for assets more than $70 trillion globally, have committed to net zero portfolios by 2050. Many of these have committed to these ambitious targets during the midst of the COVID pandemic, recognizing the urgency of climate action. Now what we need to see from them is that they actually take the right steps today to put in place the right policies, the right investments, the right choices to put us on the path to reach these targets, both for people and for the planet. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's fascinating. So we're hearing a greener recovery, better for the economy, for people, and for planet. Thank you, Helen. Okay, let me introduce you to the next two speakers. Martin O'Neill is a senior lecturer in political philosophy at the University of York in the United Kingdom. He moved across to the Department of Philosophy in 2018, having taught at the Department of Politics at York since 2010. Martin works on a number of issues at the intersection of political philosophy, political economy, and public policy. He is the co-editor of Property Owning Democracy, Rules and Beyond, published by Wiley and Blackwell in 2012, and Taxation, Philosophical Perspectives, published by Oxford University Press in 2018, and is the co-author with Joe Guinan of The Case for Community Wealth Building, published by Polity Press 2019. Martin often writes for non-academic audiences, and his writing has appeared in The Big Issue, The New Statesman, The Boston Review, and The Guardian. Our second speaker, Joe Guinan, is a Vice President of Strategy and Programmes at the Democracy Collaborative and Executive Director of the Next System Project. His focus is on political economy and economic systems change, and he is co-author with one of the other speakers, Martin, who we've just spoken about, of the Case for Community Wealth Building. A former journalist, he was previously a program director at the Espen Institute, a fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and a consultant to the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. He writes regularly for an array of progressive outlets, is a frequently cited expert on the new economics in major news media, serves on several not-profit boards, and is a commissioning editor of the journal Renewal. I will now hand over to both of those. I think, Martin, you're up first.
Thank you very much indeed, Kate. That was very full introduction. And it's a great pleasure to be here today. So Joe and I are the authors together of this book, The Case for Community Wealth Building, which we'll be talking a little bit today about the kind of approach that we argue for in that book, and in particular how it can be applied to thinking about more creating a more green economy, how the kind of community wealth building route gets you there. So very roughly, the division of labour will be that I'll introduce the general idea of community wealth building, and then Joe will talk a little bit more about some of the relevant applications. So let me just go. So the idea of community wealth building really is very straightforward. It's the idea that institutions, whether local government or large local institutions like universities, hospitals, colleges, and so on, should take a holistic view about their role within their local economy. They shouldn't see themselves just as purchasers of goods and services concerned only about the bottom line of those particular transactions. Large institutions should take a strategic view about how they coexist with the rest of their local economy, and how the kind of power, the financial power, the kind of influence that they have within that local economy can influence the way that things function for people. So what that means is that, and this is, I suppose, why a political philosopher would be writing about this topic. What that means is that these institutions, whether it's a local economy or a university or whatever it might be, if it's pursuing community wealth building, it needs to bring values more to the center of how it spends its money and how it engages with its local economy. And typically that will be thinking about how you can create a more equal economy, how you can deal with issues around sustainability. But in doing that, that's also about thinking about the value of democracy and thinking about the value of institutions that actually take more control within their economic activity and give people more of a voice and distribute power in a more equitable way throughout the economy. So I suppose the most well-known example in the UK of community wealth building is probably the so-called Preston model of Preston Council in the northwest of England. So Preston Council, after the great financial crisis, had a developer-led regeneration project that failed. Some of the large tenants pulled out, and so that traditional sort of approach to economic development looked like it had hit the buffers there. And what Preston Council did through a very visionary leader there, Matthew Brown, who was inspired by some of the work and some of the thinking that had been done by the Democracy Collaborative, so the organization that Joe, our next speaker, works for. What they did was they thought, okay, what could they do in terms of the spending of the council in Preston and of the local anchor institutions, the large local institutions like the university, the Lancashire Constabulary, the local further education colleges and so on. What could they do to spend their money in the local economy in a way that was going to drive a more equitable and more inclusive model of development in Preston? So they thought about what they could do to spend more money locally. They thought about what they could do to increase labour standards with regard to firms that they were contracting with. They looked at what they could do to use the kind of assets and resources that the local council had to drive more equitable forms of growth. And they looked at the importance of ownership in the economy and looked at what they could do in terms of helping cooperatives to establish that would then sell goods or services to the council and to the other anchor institutions. And you had this sort of holistic model of trying to create a more equal and a more democratic model in Preston using a variety of different levers. So it's a very simple idea in its core, the idea of community wealth building, but it can involve taking a lot of different sorts of policy levers to try and drive more democratic, more equal and more sustainable outcomes. So I think a really nice way of illustrating that difference is that when I was a kid, my local London borough, under the sort of dogma at the time of outsourcing and just a fixation on driving down price, outsourced the rubbish collection and parks management and so on to a company that it turned out was actually a subsidiary of Halliburton, the company that then became famous later on for its involvement with Dick Cheney and in sort of having making lots of profits from the Iraq War. Now that might have delivered a lower headline cost for some of those contracts, but what that meant was actually lower standards of employment and really just money being leached out of that community, and some of it no doubt ending up in the pockets of Dick Cheney. So that sort of broader strategic view that large public institutions, those that are tied to a particular place and aren't going to go anywhere, the University of York is always going to be in York, the same for York Council, institutions that have a connection to a place like that, instead they can take a more long-term and strategic view about how they spend, how they invest within their local economies, try to drive more equitable outcomes, disperse power and control, and see what they can do to create and to work with more plural forms of ownership in a way that gets you hopefully a recirculatory economy rather than an extractive economy. And what that means is that when we think about economics at this kind of local level, we have to bring values into it. We can't think that on the one hand there's just an issue of just a very narrow and one-eyed focus on price and only concern about values live somewhere else. We have to kind of bring values much more clearly and closely into the sorts of decision making that our institutions engage in, and that in itself involves a more democratic outcome. It means that's a way of bringing power and control down to the people who are involved with institutions at the local level. So that's just a very general sense of what the community wealth building approach involves. It's spread now to many places within the UK, Islington and Newham in London, North Ayrshire in Scotland, Wirral in the northwest of England, as well as Preston, to Salford. And where this approach has been pursued for a number of years, what you see is better outcomes in terms of a more equitable form of growth that's reducing inequality and creating economies that work better for people in each area. So that's the general approach, and I'll now hand over to my co-author Joe Guinan, who'll talk a little bit about how this kind of approach is getting used to create more green and more sustainable outcomes. So I'll hand over to Joe.
Thank you very much, Martin, and great to be with you all. I now just want to hopefully build upon what Martin's just said. Hopefully he's given you a good sense of what community wealth building is. It is in many ways a bottom-up approach to economic transformation in response to the really wicked intersecting problem that we face at the moment, which is that of economic inequality, regional and racial disparities, and of course, climate change. And it's not just lefty outriders who are recognizing these multiple overlapping crises now. Janet Yellen, Joe Biden's Treasury Secretary and former head of the Federal Reserve, said as much on day one of her entering her new job. And to tackle these crises, which of course, as Helen mentioned, we now have to add COVID to, we need to actually, our contention is fundamentally rewire the way the economy works so that it's not actually working directly against us. Let me say a word about that. I think the sort of dirty word that we have to mention in this conversation in many ways is capitalism, and in particular neoliberal capitalism. And I think community wealth building as an approach has really emerged in response to growing recognition that our economies, whether that's locally or nationally and internationally, are simply not working for the many, only for the wealthy few. And that this is more than just a policy failure. It's actually intrinsic to how those economies are actually structured and operate. Left to their own devices, after 4 decades of neoliberalism, what these economies serve to do is concentrate wealth and power and redistribute it upwards, with all the associated costs that come from that in terms of climate change, inequality, racial inequities, regional imbalances, not to mention the dangerous effects on democracy. So the problem, and Martin mentioned this word, is that we have an extractive economy. What do we mean by that? An extractive economy then is one in which wealth and power flow upwards to the elites who own all the assets. These elites make their money not by producing goods and services that are useful to everybody, but by owning assets in a financialized economy. So landlords and property developers control land, energy companies control natural resources, banks control the money supply. Even CEOs are making more now from stock options than they are from their salaries. And the economy is therefore built around the battle to control these assets, which doesn't actually produce new wealth, but instead extracts wealth from others and from communities through sky-high rents, through rip-off energy bills, usurious bank charges, or share buybacks that simply bid up asset values. And that same extractive logic in the economy applies to the natural world and to the unsustainable extraction of natural resources that's pushing us further and further into environmental catastrophe. And so it's really in response to this that community wealth building has emerged. So what does community wealth building look like in practical, not just theoretical terms? Let me give you some examples in sort of roughly ascending order of scale and ambition. Martin mentioned Cleveland, Ohio, and this is really the birthplace of the community wealth building approach. It's a post-industrial city in the US Midwest, once home to massive industry. Standard Oil was headquartered there. I think Cleveland once had 50 of the first 100 millionaires in the country, but then it was ravaged by deindustrialization, disinvestment, capital flight. What was left behind was poverty, neighborhoods falling apart. But not everything. There were those anchors that Martin mentioned, the large place-based nonprofit and public or quasi-public institutions, the City of Cleveland's local government, Cleveland Clinic, one of the top research hospitals in the United States, Case Western Reserve University, university hospitals. Total them all up, and what you get is massive spending power, billions a year in goods and services, almost none of which was being recirculated back into the community. And so in response to that, we at the Democracy Collaborative and others helped set up the Evergreen Cooperatives, which was a network of green worker cooperatives linked by a golden share that was held by a community corporation. So the workers that own Evergreen can't just sell it to private equity and pull up the ladder after one generation of ownership. Those companies are staying rooted in the community. And of course, they're all green companies. There's an industrial scale laundry, the greenest in the Midwest in terms of water and energy use. A large hydroponic greenhouse the size of a football field, which produces leafy greens and herbs. A solar and weatherization company doing renewable energy and green retrofits. On the face of it, the green connection then is obvious. Take the greenhouse. Instead of bringing 1 million heads of lettuce from California or Mexico with all the carbon costs of transportation, not to mention what's built into the production methods, instead we see them grown locally and within environmental limits. If you eat a salad in Northeast Ohio, it's very much likely to be from Green City growers now, the Evergreen Company. There's also a deeper grammar to what we're doing in Cleveland, which is really about not throwing away our cities in the way that we have been doing. Cleveland essentially is now looking at a model of recirculation, of regeneration. These are principles from ecology that we now need to bring deep into the heart of economics. If you spend money locally, it stays locally. There's a multiplier effect. It's estimated to be 8 compared to if you spend money with a multinational corporation, it immediately leaves your community, often to go offshore to a tax haven and to distant shareholders. The next example is really Preston. Martin's already mentioned Preston. Preston is really at the tip of the spear in the UK for advancing this model. And what it's done is built upon what we did really in a neighborhood and at the neighborhood level in Lancashire and in Cleveland, and taken that to sort of citywide scale, where you're seeing a sort of whole of government approach that's really using all the levers that are available, bringing together all the anchors, but also pension investments, a community bank, and with help from the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, they're hoping to roll out the next phases of that community wealth building strategy. And once the idea has sort of taken root, it's now begun to spread, and we're seeing something like 50 places around the UK now, including the Welsh government and the Scottish government, taking up community wealth building as an approach to building a fairer, better, greener, and rooted community serving economy in their areas. One of my favorite examples is in North Ayrshire in Scotland, which is a really exciting sort of full-blooded approach to community wealth building at the regional level. Preston's a small district council. It only has about £20 million of a discretionary budget. It had to rely heavily on mobilizing those anchor institutions. North Ayrshire, on the other hand, is much bigger. It's got £1 billion in procurement alone. And basically what that means is you can develop a strategy that works across all the pillars of community wealth building, as Claire's has articulated. Plural ownership of the economy, making financial power work for local places, fair employment and just labor markets, progressive procurement, as we've mentioned, but also socially productive use of land and property. And what you're seeing in North Ayrshire is that they're connecting community wealth building to their plans for a local Green New Deal and taking this whole of government approach deep into green industrial strategy. Just yesterday, Joe Cullinane, the leader of North Ayrshire, announced plans for a second council-owned solar farm that's being developed on a former landfill site, reducing CO2 emissions, but also providing a financial surplus back to the community. What I think we now need to do is take all of these models, which demonstrably work in practice, and actually make them work in theory. I think there needs to be a revolution in economic thinking. We're already seeing people like Kate Raworth and Catherine Trebek and others pointing the way. It involves overhauling outdated economic models and ways of thinking. Martin mentioned lowest unit cost. It's meant a race to the bottom, but what we saw with PPE and COVID was that when the pandemic hit, it's not even efficient on its own terms. So we need to onshore production and bring it back so that we're not relying on overstretched and fragile global supply chains, but actually producing locally for real local needs. We also, frankly, need to interrogate neoclassical trade models with their sort of false notions of equilibrium and really think about new ways of measuring the economy. Because as we all know, in economics, what you measure is what you think is important. And a sort of narrow focus on GDP, on cost benefit analysis, on the balance sheets of individual companies or government misses out so much that we actually need to be looking to and measuring, which is social return, environmental return, living within boundaries, tackling inequalities, and frankly, looking at the spillover effects that a broken economic model has on our democracy, which we've seen in the last number of years. So I know I'm at time. And I should stop here and say thank you for listening and look forward to the question and answer. Thanks.
Thank you so much to both of you for that fascinating insight. I really look forward to exploring more in our discussions how community wealth can help to redistribute that wealth and create a more equitable and fair economy for the many rather than the few. Now let's hear our next two speakers before we move into that discussion phase. Our next speaker is Espen Stoknes. He's a psychologist with a PhD in economics, a TED Global speaker, and serves as the director of Centre for Sustainability and Energy at the Norwegian Business School. An associate professor with the school's Department of Law and Governance, he is an experienced foresight facilitator and academic who is also a serial entrepreneur, including co-founding clean tech company Gas Plus. He's also the author of several books, including Tomorrow's Economy, A Guide to Creating Healthy Green Growth, and the award-winning book, What We Think About When We Try Not to Think About Global Warming. is also a serving member of the Norwegian Parliament, and I believe that is where he is as we speak. Over to you, Per.
Thanks, Kate. Real pleasure being with you. And I also bring a Norwegian bird along with me here today. His name is Yu, to represent the natural capital. So what I would like to do is a short summary of some key ideas, this being the York Festival of Ideas, on how to navigate the systems shift that both Helen, Joe and Martin has been describing so well so far. So key and core to the new book, Tomorrow's Economy, is this idea of how do we accelerate the systems shift in a way that is sufficiently rapid. So hopefully now the screen sharing works well. And as Kate just mentioned, I spent many years researching the psychology of climate communications, why it's so hard for people to really take in the urgency, the catastrophe we're approaching, and the dire warnings of climate science. And this was the topic of my TED Global talk with now more than 3 million views. And in it, I provided the individual analysis, but I also recommended a solution in terms of providing the new narrative. How do we provide an engaging and new narrative that makes people along all the political spectrum and all the different economic classes want to come along? And this is what Tomorrow's Economy tries to address. Since 2017, there was a wave of climate concern, both with the bad news of the 2018, 2019, but of course also the rise of the climate movement, and particularly Greta put the conditions that we are discussing as usual into a nutshell. So ecosystems are collapsing and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of economic growth. Hence, we shouldn't look to the kids for kind of providing deep economic analysis or the tools, but we should be very grateful for them raising the alarm in a way. And now it's up to the grown-ups to provide that attractive and plausible narrative of how we change the system in time for this generation to also share a healthy planet. And in the book, I take as a starting point what I call the paradox of growth, that being used to teaching green growth and green economics, I hear and I'm confronted all the time with somebody always wanting to explain out to me that Stoknes, we cannot have eternal growth on a limited planet, which is of course true the minute you define growth as being growth in materials use, but we can have growth of a lot of other qualities that we could hopefully grow in a much smarter way. And if so, we need to know, are we on the right track or not? We also need to know more about where are the planetary boundaries and what do we mean with, for instance, eternal. In politics, at least, when we think in centuries, that's almost eternal. And as I said, I'm going to vote afterwards, mostly short-term policy issues. But if we take the long view, going back to 1750s, we all know that the economic growth, markets, GDP measures, etc., were dependent on a series of waves of innovation. And starting out with the mechanization wave from steam and spinning jennies and weaving, going through the steel and rail and the rubber barons, Henry Ford with the mass production paradigm and transistor after the Second World War. I won't repeat this innovation history here, just briefly walk you through it. And of course, we're still living in the aftermath of the fifth wave, which is the terms of internet and the DNA revolution. And still 5 out of the world's biggest companies are all from this fifth wave. What we're seeing now is a shift to the sixth wave, where we'll focus on radical resource productivity being run on renewables and circular material flows. Entering this shift is a radical change in the direction of the economy that we need to understand, not just larger in volume, but a new direction of innovation, but also of all economic activity. And this is then, with green growth, I really mean to how do we measure the speed of the green shift? And the basic idea is that for 200 years, we invested in labor productivity, replacing human labor with machines driven by fossil energy. That was the driving force behind all the 5 revolutions. But the sixth wave, we will now achieve the same incredible improvements in resource productivity that we have previously achieved in labor productivity. So like in 30, 40 years, we'll be able to do maybe 100 to 200 times as much with each barrel of oil or each piece of timber or each kilowatt hour than what we've been done in the previous century. So in the same way that labor productivity was improved 100 times, we should be able to improve resource productivity 100 times. It's just difficult to believe sometimes in front of the wave. So in order to measure the speed of this, I provide a green growth compass where you can simply plot the economic growth or the activity level of the economy, either as degrowth or a growth on the vertical axis, and then on the other, the ecological footprint, measured either as carbon footprint, material footprint, or ecological footprint, the latter being the most encompassing. Hence, if we can improve the growth while bringing down footprint sufficiently rapidly enough, we would have the chance to get back within planetary boundaries by 2050. And that means we cannot just fool around somewhere around the origo here. We need to move at least up to a resource productivity rate of more than 5% improvement each year. So the good thing of this is that you can take any company, any community, any city, any sector, any country, and then map the annual movement in terms of economic activity and the footprint, and then you can see whether in the genuine green growth triangle or not. Happily, investors are coming along on this ride, and even BlackRock are recognizing that low carbon productivity is a huge investment risk. And this is, of course, the world's biggest investors. That helps. They're not doing it in order to be kind. They're doing it because research too is showing that, yes, indeed, 90% of studies done, and more than 2,000 studies done, show that sustainable companies are actually more profitable as well. And recently, we've seen a surge of this, as if the huge tsunami is starting with companies such as Ørsted, Vestas, SolarEdge, QuantumScape, Beyond Meat, and Tesla driving this surge. And of course, this really helps us pick up the speed of the green growth so we can realize the green shift in time. And the same thing has been seen in terms of ESG investments, or what's called environmental, social, and governance rankings of the companies that these funds invest in. So I would say that we're looking into a kind of decisive decade right now, where we will see an acceleration due to these 7 deep drivers. And we've been speaking about sustainability for like 34 years. It's our common future in 1987. Not much happened, but right now I see acceleration in these 7. And that's why I expect them to become a tsunami over the next 10 years. The renewable cost curves, ESG is suddenly for real, material flows go digital and circular, more emphasis on climate risk, the SDG and the Paris Agreement's first common plan ever, and the G3, all EU, US, and China have all committed to net zero. And of course, as also mentioned by previous speakers, COVID-19 has killed off neoliberalistic ideology and resurrected an active government to help drive this. Fewer words about the other dimension of sustainability, the rapid inequality. And since Helen mentioned Indonesia, here are some pictures from Jakarta, and here are some girls that also want dignified lives. And in order to monitor the speed of that change, whether on community or country level, I suggest we adopt the PALMA index rather than the Gini to measure inequality. So, and PALMA 1 seems to be ideal for keeping social trust both in cities and countries, and we should then require growth not just to be green but also to be inclusive. So countries such as Norway, Denmark, Finland, but also Slovenia and Slovakia have a PALMA of 1, and South Africa has a PALMA of about 7. That means that the top 10% takes 7 times the amount of the 40% bottom together, and then you get living conditions like this with the Gulf course here and the shanty town there. So that's what 7 PALMA looks like. So to sum up, we need not just a green growth, we need a fair growth where the economic activity creates a bigger pie, and that the 40% poorest get a larger share of the bigger pie. And the same way, you need not just along the diagonal here, but you need to have a social productivity or growth at least 5% per year. So with that, our problem is currently not capitalism as such, or government, or consumers, but it's really an incredible resource wastefulness that we got from the 5 first revolutions. Happily, there's a shift in innovation now from labor to resource productivity, and this needs to be increased. it's getting much more profitable. Green is the new black. And this sixth wave of a deep accelerating shift, but the exact timing is unknown. And then we need, in order to have not just green growth, also to have fair growth to create a truly healthy growth. And with that, I think my 7 minutes are up, and I'd like to hand the words over to Sara.
Thank you, Per. I think I'm going to introduce Sara. That was absolutely fascinating. I just wanted to make one note, which is that Per has to leave us, as he said, to vote at 2 o'clock. So if you do have questions for Per, please do put them in the Q&A and we'll try and get to them first so that we can hear his perspective. So yes, on to our last speaker. Sara Reis is Head of Research and Policy at the Women's Budget Group. Sara is currently coordinating WBG's work on a feminist Green New Deal, the local data project, and the impact of COVID-19 on women. Since joining the Women's Budget Group in 2017, she has been involved in various projects, including research on female poverty, funding for the women's sector, affordable housing, and economic circumstances of migrant women in the UK. Sara has a PhD in politics from the University of Sheffield. Welcome, Sara.
Thank you very much, Kate, and thank you very much for the team for inviting me to speak on this panel. It's really a pleasure to be here at the York Festival of Ideas. So for those of you who don't know us at the Women's Budget Group, I'd like to start with a very brief introduction. So we work to analyze the impact of economic policy on women and men, and to promote alternative policies for a gender equal future in the UK in particular. And so currently, as Kate mentioned, we are running a project with the Women's Environmental Network on a feminist Green New Deal. And our goal is to encourage groups working on the environment to consider gender and gender equality and how their proposals for a green transition will affect women, while also encouraging women's organizations to engage with the climate emergency and what that will mean for the women that they support. So the topic of this session is very pertinent to our work. I'd like to start by saying that the main rationale behind us doing the Feminist Green New Deal project is that Green New Deal planning, or any plans for a green transition, must also recognize the needs of both planet and people. And it is not guaranteed that a green transition will be a just one or a fair one, or that it would lead to better outcomes for women and marginalized groups. So this is something that needs to be purposefully built into the Green New Deal plans. And in fact, when we did some analysis on this for our Commission on a Gender Equal Economy, we found that Green New Deal plans rarely consider gender inequalities. And some of these green measures that are often proposed can even exacerbate gender inequalities or create new ones if they are not intentionally addressed. So, for example, proposals to reform food production and consumption, to to prioritize cooking meals from scratch using fresh produce, all of that, it has the potential to increase women's unpaid work unless these reforms or these measures include strategies to transform who is responsible for most of the shopping and the cooking of food, which now at the moment tends to be mostly women. And another example, an example around transport. So when we have plans to discourage car use, which are really important, but they can only work for women if we have a public transport system that enables everyone to move around in a safe and affordable way. So currently the UK transport system, and which is kind of the same trend across the world, invests more in the long distance commuter than in those taking multiple shorter trips. And this is gendered. So these different travel patterns are gendered because women are more likely to use buses and to complete multiple shorter journeys throughout the day, often because they are, dropping off the kids at school, or they're responsible for grocery shopping, or they are accompanying someone to their hospital appointment, whereas men are more likely to travel on longer journeys by rail, usually. So active travel, also such as walking and cycling, is very important. It should be a part of any green transport systems of the future, but they can also have some barriers relating to safety, accessibility, and it ends up being the case that it's often safer, quicker, and less burdensome for women to just travel by car or taxi. And also on top of this, women, but also people of color, disabled people, and people on low incomes are less likely to own a car, which means that if your transport system is inaccessible, it can leave many, especially in rural areas, subject to social and spatial isolation. One of the main tools to address social inequality in Green New Deal plans is the creation of new jobs. Yet the focus is very much restricted to green technologies, or to planning and thinking about green technologies, which at the moment are largely male dominated. Many current Green New Deal plans also fail to recognize the benefit of expanding the definition of a green job to include existing low carbon and foundational jobs such as care work, including childcare and adult social care sectors, which are mostly done by women and are rather labor intensive and low carbon jobs. And investing in the care sector is an excellent way to stimulate green employment, while also transforming our current broken social care system. And it's also a way of reducing the gender pay gap when we invest in those. So we, at the Women's Budget Group, we carried out some modeling on this, and found that if, like in some Scandinavian countries, if the UK had 10% of its employment in care, this would generate nearly 2 million jobs in the economy as a whole, not just in these sectors, but in the rest of the economy, through a ripple effect of increasing the spending power of many people. So it would mean it would raise the overall employment rate in the UK by 5 percentage points, and it would also reduce the gender employment gap by 4 percentage points, as these sectors, as they are currently, are mostly done by women. So while for such an investment in the care economy, you would need a annual spending of around 2% of GDP, a lot of this funding would be recouped in things like more tax revenue and savings on benefits, because of more people in employment. And we also found that investment in care jobs would produce 2.7 times as many jobs as an equivalent investment in, for example, construction. But very importantly, the care sector is also a relatively low carbon sector. So it's a third less polluting than the construction sector, for example. So we're very interesting to hear that just recently the government's announced they're setting up a green taxonomy advisory group. So this is to define officially what can be considered a green job, and to avoid attempts of greenwashing by firms and by investment funds. And we think that a wider definition encompassing jobs in care would be crucial to affecting the transformational change and the social justice change that is required to meet the target emission reductions. So as we begin rebuilding after the pandemic and looking to COP26 later this year, there is really no better time to ask if we really want to go back to business as usual. We are currently faced with a we're still very much in the grips of global pandemic, but we're also facing an unfolding technological revolution, a climate emergency, and entrenched inequalities, as my other colleague speakers have explained. So really, at the Women's Budget Group, we are calling for a new economy, an economy which has the well-being of individuals, communities, and the planet at its center. And this should be an economy which values care, both paid and unpaid, as the activities that nurture us all, and an economy which ensures that no one faces discrimination, poverty, and which no one is left behind. So what we're calling is for a green and a caring economy for people and planet. So I'll leave it here. Thanks very much for listening, and I look forward to the discussion afterwards.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sara. Okay, we are going to move into the discussion part of the session now for the next half an hour or so. So we will be asking our panelists to answer some questions. So if I could ask them all to put their cameras on, get ready to ask some questions, to answer some questions. I will be coming to the audience questions as well, so please do keep putting those in the Q&A box. I know that Per is going to have to go pretty soon, so I think I'm going to come to him first, but the question that I'm going to pose to all of you to get a discussion started is that if you had found yourself on a Cornish beach last weekend with the G7 members, what is the one thing that you would be asking of them to build this fairer, greener economy that you talk about? But I'd also like to put in that a little bit of urgency. What do you be asking for them now, sooner rather than later? So Per, if I could maybe start with you.
Great question. And also it's tricky because it's never just one thing. We all long for this having silver bullet, that would fix the whole thing, and that doesn't exist. So if I'm pushed for one, I'll give two. And that is, of course, first, we should just put a ban on fossil investments at a specific date into the future, let's say anywhere from 2 to 10 years from now, so that investors and industrial players could start to plan for exactly when they would have to have the green innovations in place to run successful, more profitable businesses, but without the fossil investments. That would fix a lot. Second, we can't do that without, at the same time, providing unemployment benefits for those who are going to lose their jobs as a function of that ban. So hence, rapidly improved unemployment benefits, including free re-education, particularly also including for women, and financed by a higher corporate tax.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Concrete.
Helen, yeah. Helen, how about you?
Thanks very much. The one thing I would have asked had I been on that Cornish beach with them is that they really start now to step up the finance they're providing to support developing countries in the climate transition. This is absolutely essential. It's the developing countries, the ones that are most vulnerable to climate impacts, and yet the ones who actually produce the least in terms of emissions. They're also being hit by the COVID crisis in drastic ways, and facing the economic, the income loss, and other crises that other colleagues have spoken so eloquently about today. So they're the ones that are being hit the most. G7 countries and other developed countries, I think it was actually 11 years ago now, committed to providing $100 billion per year in climate finance internationally by 2020. And we're not yet on track to realize that, and we're 2021. So in the midst of this crisis, given all that we've said and the impacts we're seeing, now is the time to step up that climate finance to support developing countries.
Thank you. Martin, what do you ask for?
So I think those are two very good suggestions. And so let me just suggest a kind of, an addition to Per's suggestion about banning future investments in fossil fuels. Let's get all of the world's central banks to actually use some of this newfound ability they have to generate new balances through quantitative easing to just buy out a lot of the existing fossil fuel capitalist structures that are there, right? So, I mean, Per's thinking about how you manage the consequences of, saying that, buy a particular time fossil fuels just have to be left in the ground. Let's bring that forward. Let's just use the money creation power of the state to kill that industry dead as quickly as we possibly can, in a way that actually uses the democratic power of national governments to achieve that, and doesn't just doesn't push it off into the future. And actually, this is something that the Democracy Collaborative, that the organisation that Joe works for, have done a very interesting paper on this that I'll put a link in the chat. But I think it's a wonderful idea.
Over to you then, Joe.
Thanks, Kate. I guess there's a reason why Martin and I wrote a book together, because he's definitely jumped on what I was going to talk about in terms of QE and central banking. For anyone interested, that sort of notion of QE for the planet, of buying out the oil industry for political reasons, as well as the immediate sort of economic transition reasons. We've done a lot of work on that, including detailing the long history of nationalizations in the United States that have taken place at different times that people don't know about. So we'll get that link to anyone that's interested. I suppose I want to now flex the green QE sort of argument in a slightly different way. Per mentioned the sort of death of neoliberalism, and I'm worried that that isn't quite upon us yet. That on the one hand, there's the behavior of central banks and governments, where we've seen the sort of liquidity taps opened up, and there's basically already overt monetary financing of the UK government's spending at the moment. That is basically the Bank of England is paying for what the government is spending. And so the illusion that we rely upon tax revenues for government spending should be done once and for all. But actually, it's being done behind a curtain, and we're still in this notion of constrained finances. And so I actually think one thing that I would have asked on that Cornish beach is that this direct flow of monetary financing that's coming from the world's central banks actually be devolved to lower levels of government. You've heard about the experimentation and the bold new directions that are being taken by local governments and communities. We should give them access to this new green liquidity. And then, of course, I absolutely endorse Helen's point about the need for transfers at the global scale. And again, I think that a lot is possible, and we're not in a resource constrained environment in terms of money and financing, and it's essential for the future of the planet. So let's get on with it.
And Sara, what would you ask for?
So in the G7, the Boris Johnson, the UK's Prime Minister, said that we need to build back better, bizarrely in a more feminine way. That were his words. I'm not sure I know what he means. But if he wants to invest, or if he meant he wants to invest in a building back better towards an economy that works better for women and therefore for all, I think it's really important to focus on investing in care-led recovery. So making sure that there is a sustainable long-term investment in our social care and our childcare infrastructure, because this will not just translate in more employment, in more jobs, like I explained in my presentation, but it would also mean that we would have a better cared for, a healthier, a more resilient population, and a more resilient economy and society to be able to face things like future pandemics and climate disaster. So that would be the one thing that I would definitely prioritize.
So we've pulled together quite a good checklist of action that we want to ask our world leaders. Helen, I might just come back to you, ask for sort of the reflections on what you've heard from others, but also there's a specific question in the Q&A saying what would you want to see, what concrete action would you want to see at the next big conference, or one of the next big conferences, COP26, towards the end of this year? What would you hope to see from that?
Thanks very much. That's a good question. And actually, I think there's probably three things I'd really want to see at COP26 or before. So, I mean, COP26 is the moment when countries come together to take the next big steps on what they're doing on climate action. But there's actually the series of meetings, including the G7 summit last weekend, there's a UN meeting in New York, well, virtual or in New York in September. There's the G20 summit, etc. There's various meetings in the lead up to that. And I think the package that we need is going to come at COP26 or in the lead up to it. So it's sort of a combination of these two. And the three things are, first and foremost, that we actually, countries, companies, investors actually put us on track to a world where we could potentially keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's what the scientists say are going to limit the worst impacts of climate change. So we want to be on that world. And the net zero targets that I mentioned before from countries, companies, and businesses and investors are really starting to put us on the right track, but we're not quite there yet. So we need more to come forward and to step up their sort of intermediate targets, 2030 targets, so they're actually going on the right track and their investments now in the green economy. So one is keeping that 1.5C target alive through those individual commitments. The second is what I just mentioned a moment before. We absolutely need to step up international climate finance to support the most vulnerable developing countries, both in adapting to climate change, which they didn't cause, but are bearing the brunt of it, but also to help them transition their economies too. And then the third is that we also have to agree a number of things at COP26 in terms of the rule book of how internationally countries work together. How do they report to each other? What's the transparency in terms of their actions, the targets they set, how they're reporting back in a sort of clear format and a way which is comparable amongst themselves. So that's part of it. Part of it is also what do we do with international carbon markets? How do countries work together to actually achieve these targets and these goals? And so some of those, we call it the sort of Paris rulebook. Some of those are still outstanding and need to be agreed so that we can go forward from COP26 with a clear international plan, what we need from countries, and all able to achieve that.
Yeah, it really strikes me that obviously these huge global problems need to be tackled both at an international, a national and a local level. And some of the questions that are coming through in the Q&A are around that sort of the political barriers to that type of collaboration, whether it's the need for a really long-term view. There was a question about how do we do it with the political cycles, but also sort of how do we level the playing field for inclusive growth? So should that be led at local level, national level, or even international level? I might come to Martin and Joe on that, particularly around the sort of community wealth building. How do you think we can do that and remove any political barriers?
I'll let Joe go first this time, given that I stole his thunder on the previous one, so he can have the first bite at this one.
Thanks. I mean, I think it really is about making sure that we remove the barriers to local leaders who are increasingly stepping forward, increasingly proving the models. This isn't pie in the sky. You can kick the tires, you can walk around Evergreen, you can walk around Preston and see what's going on there. Actually, interestingly, though, there's also a political valence to this. We just saw this in the UK local elections where there was a particular national tide, but in the few places that were actually practicing community wealth building and these approaches, they tended to be Labour councils. And although it's not exclusively a Labour agenda, the SNP is moving on this in Scotland. We're even hearing moves in Northern Ireland. But basically, the councils that have been promoting this agenda aggressively managed to swim against the tide of the overall result, and people recognize what is being done and want support for it. And so now, thinking about the opportunities of rewriting procurement law in the UK, one opportunity that definitely arises from departure from the European Union is to relook at how we do procurement law and allow it to be directed towards social value and environmental value. Thinking about banking in a different way. Again, in the UK, we've got one of the most centralized banking systems in the world, even more than in the United States. And thinking about different banking models, including public banking models and community banks and credit unions and different ways of getting finance to growing the new sector that we need to see, which is, and there's a bit of a paradox and a challenge there, right? This is a lot of these new models of ownership are the ones that wire social and environmental sustainability right into the enterprise itself. And yet these models aren't always as attractive to private finance because they tend not to need to grow in the same way. And that's the paradox, right? We need to grow an economy that itself doesn't need to grow in the old way. And so the public finance piece of that is going to be incredibly important. I think there are political returns, as I said, to pursuing this that are beginning to be understood. And so we need to start building up pressure. Going back to the previous conversation, there probably should be a coalition of mayors and local authorities and the devolved governments saying to Whitehall and to Westminster, give us access to Bank of England liquidity to pursue the recovery that we need. Does it need to be Andy Burnham stood up on live TV talking about how essentially Greater Manchester is getting the short end of the stick? We ought to be bringing this pressure to bear politically on the government and actually bringing those powers, devolving those powers, including financial powers, down to the levels where people have actually got real solutions that have been proven.
I think just to follow on from that, but part of the values justification for policies like community wealth building is the thought that we've got reason to have a more democratic economy, that, you know, part of the sort of disaffection that, you know, what one saw leading towards you know, the Brexit vote, that, you know, why was the slogan "Take Back Control" so successful? Well, in part, I think in many communities there was a sense that people didn't locally have the kinds of powers, access to the kind of influence that they need in order to solve local problems. It's like, you know, London can seem very distant from many parts of the United Kingdom. So I think that the political centralization of the UK, which goes hand in hand with regional disparities, gives you a structure that's very, very bad at delivering real power and real sort of democratic influence to local areas in terms of, you know, what local government can do is so constrained. And of course, the level of funding that local government has had from the centre, especially since 2010, has been cut so brutally that, you know, very often what you find is that, you know, wonderfully inventive people in local government are doing their best with diminishing resources to try to deal with problems that they have more access to, they can see, and if we were serious about trying to have a political system that was better at, you know, seeing what the problems people face in their lives, giving people the tools that they need then to deal with those, that kind of decentralization in terms of both in terms of the financing of different levels of government, but also just of having larger decision-making power at levels closer to people, would give you a completely different kind of structure. So I mean, these things come up in different places, in different ways in different countries, but I think in the UK, the multiple forms of over-centralization that we have really stop us from making use of the kind of ingenuity that we have in dealing with the problems that we face at different levels. So, you know, some reforms in that direction would be good to see.
Hey, could I add one brief thought on this? Because I think one of the things I've been mentioning, sort of the net zero and the climate commitments of countries and companies and investors. In fact, some of the most interesting work is happening at the city level or in states and provinces around the world. And what we've really seen is these are often the sort of what we call the hotbeds of experimentation on new models of growth, but also new models of climate action. And in a number of cases, basically, we've sort of reached tipping points where enough cities or states are starting to do something, put in sort of building energy efficiency standards, carbon pricing, et cetera, that basically the national government has looked at this and said, oh, interesting, this seems to be working. All right, we'll take it on board. So you have this incredible, I think this is also something that's worth thinking about, is how all that's happening at the local level in communities, in cities, can really also help to inspire action at the national level and then internationally. Yes, laboratories of democracy, I like that. Thank you.
Thanks. I want to bring Sara into the discussion a bit, because it seems to me that this sort of centralization of policy gives a single lens on many more complex issues, and gender is one of those lenses, as we obviously heard. So, you know, I'd be interested in your thoughts, Sara, about the sort of where these policy decisions should be made and how to get that diversity in terms of looking at the implications of any policy decisions and making sure it supports what we're talking about, which is building a fairer economy for all.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on the points that were already made, particularly by Martin and Joe, around funding and making sure that if you are decentralizing powers, the money is also kind of following that, because I think what we have been witnessing in the UK in recent years has been an increase in statutory responsibilities for local councils, local authorities, but with big and severe cuts to the funding that they receive from central government, from Westminster. So there has been a shift in trying to get local authorities to rely on local tax revenues, things like council tax, business rates, and that is a problem because it has the potential to increase regional inequalities, because some of the places that are the least able to raise revenues in that way, because they are poorer areas, because they have, you know, they have more poorer households or poorer people living in them, are also some of the places with the highest levels of need in terms of things like social care, because they will also are more likely to be to have older populations. And so there is a risk that if you move into a system where funding and finance is devolved to the local or regional level, then those regional disparities might increase. So I think there is still a role for central government to coordinate some of this, or to make sure that local councils, local authorities have access to central sources of funding to be able to implement what they know is best for their local economies and for their local societies. But I think also some of the things that I was talking about in terms of investing in the care economy, so things like social care or childcare, I think to some extent that needs to come from central government. At least the funding needs to come from central government, because many of the benefits or many of the savings or the recouping of that investment is also going to be reaped at the central level. So things like, you know, increased tax revenues because you have more people in employment, savings on benefits because you have less people relying on them, that comes to the central exchequer. And so there's also that issue of making sure that central government also has a role to play in managing these investments.
So this sort of I suppose idea of targeting support policy need at the sort of most vulnerable, or those that need it most, or perhaps the most undervalued, as you're talking about the care economy. There's a specific question for Helen actually on the Q&A, which is around the fact that you talked about higher incomes, a part of building back stronger, and as to whether that is just a general raising of income levels, or whether there's some sort of idea about targeted, targeting those that currently have low incomes.
Absolutely a focus on targeting that. I mean, we have around the world today just still far too much poverty, many countries around the world. And in fact, for the first time in about 20 years, we've actually had more people slip into poverty last year because of the COVID crisis. In the past, we've been seeing growth out of poverty. Last year, we went the wrong direction. So it's very much focused on how do we actually support those who need within a given economy, within a given community, but also internationally, how we ensure that people are able to grow. I mean, it is interesting. We've had a number of discussions already so far on this panel about, stagnating growth, degrowth, and what's the right sort of approach forward. We are seeing in more advanced economies, more developed economies, that they slow down growth, very slow in many cases, and then it's really a question of redistribution of growth and how you actually redistribute those benefits so that all are being lifted up. Those who don't have the wealth are being lifted up. I think that's going to be important. But we also do see countries, and China is a very interesting example. They've been growing extremely fast over the last 10, 20 years, very, very rapid growth. And it's a very centrally planned economy, as you know, and the government last year basically said, look, we want to see more stable, 2 years ago, I guess, we want to see more stable growth and at lower levels. China should grow at a lower, a slower pace. We do not need that high growth. That's not what we want to aim for anymore. So you are seeing this recognition that it's more about how do you actually balance this and ensure equity and better income distribution in economies. Sadly, that's not how it always plays out in politics. And I would give the US as an example where we have seen certainly over the last 4 years, massive tax breaks going to the richest, and some theories have trickled down. And what we've clearly seen is that has not trickled down. Right. So it doesn't always play out in politics. Those who have the strongest, loudest voices sometimes are those who are already the most privileged. And so this is an area where not just governments, but also communities, civil society, others need to speak up and make sure that that's not the way the political decisions go.
I just want to bring in Joe and Martin into this discussion because I hear from your talks, you were talking about the economy's not working for the many, the sort of concentration of wealth and power, and obviously that applies both at an individual level but also at regional levels as well. I don't know if you want to comment on that, Martin.
I'll let Joe go first on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, again, I talked about this wicked problem, and we can actually put numbers on it, right? In the United States, right, there's the problem of overconsumption, right? We're consuming 2.5 planets, and we need to get back within 1. There's also the racial wealth gap, which is being estimated at 10 trillion, which is half of US GDP. And then at the same time, you've got economic inequality in society, whereby something like 400 individuals at the top now own as much wealth as the bottom 180 million Americans. And what you get out of a context like that is a very difficult political problem. There's a landing zone there that involves doing something about ecological overshoot, which involves some combination of green growth in some areas and degrowth in others. There's a redistributive problem that we need to tackle that is also a regional problem, Kate, as you're saying. And obviously politics comes down to place, and all politics is local, as Tip O'Neill reminded us. And so really thinking about how we can craft, and I think the understanding of what needs to be done is really advancing at the moment. We've got the models, we've got the tools, we've got the destinations. Where we're really lacking is understanding the politics that can put this together in a way that really allows us to unleash the economic power, the innovation that Per was talking about, in a way that allows us to do it in time. There's a problem with succeeding too slowly, which is that it might amount to the same thing as failing, given the hard constraints that we're up against. And so I think a lot of energy, as well as continuing to do the research and continuing to apply the pressure, for the kinds of things that we've been talking about on this panel, a lot of energy needs to go into solving that wicked political problem that allows us to take care of disparities, that allows us to rebuild communities, that allows us to grow and degrow in the right balance without falling into the sort of political bear traps that are out there for us. And I think the experience of Trump and the last several years in the United States is the danger of not figuring out that politics correctly.
I mean, just to add to that, I think the issue of economic inequality within a country and the kind of regional inequalities that you have, so starkly in the UK, it's just so intimately connected with the issue about inequalities of power, right? That you can't expect there to be, the kind of economic transformation that you'd hope for to create a country with less in the way of economic inequality, unless there are actually ways that people within particular communities can have more voice and more power and more control. So I think that project, it's worth thinking about the different values that are at stake there, right? So that it seems unjustifiable to citizens if your life chances so depend on the part of the country that you're born in, and at the same time, if the kind of the way in which public money is spent, rather than correcting that, just exacerbates it. So, as we know, it's very hard to travel around the north of England, right? It's, the rail links between large metropolitan cities in the UK compared with, think of the Ruhr Valley in Germany, or, think of China, where you have sort of, well-connected city centres, and then go from York to Liverpool, and it takes a surprisingly long time. So I think the political and the economic issues are so deeply entwined here, and taking either of them seriously involves taking the other seriously as well. But I think that if you think about policies like community wealth building that are about trying to have a less extractive economic model, that at least gives you some kind of a foothold that different communities can try and use, even the kind of limited powers that they have to kind of to get a foothold and to try and find ways of actually influencing the economic trajectory of their communities. But to really kind of supercharge that progress, you need, I think, both the political change and the economic change. The two of them are just very closely connected to one another.
And Martin, while you're talking, there is there's a comment come up in Q&A about this sort of narrow window of opportunity perhaps that we've got coming out of COVID around more local, place-based growth. Is it now or never?
Well, I wouldn't say now or never, but that's a great question. I mean, I guess there's a big decision, isn't there, about what the future of work is actually going to look like, and whether we're going to see that sort of return to perhaps excessive and needless levels of commuting, or whether actually we want to have the kind of infrastructure in place that would allow that would allow a continuation of more home working. I mean, but what that probably, I mean, thinking back to roads not taken, it would have been, if we'd known that COVID was coming, having something like a state provided reliable high-speed broadband infrastructure would have been a very good thing to have. Having sort of properly funded state investment banks with a kind of regional mandate that looked at how you can develop regional centres, how you can develop towns, how you can actually think about a kind of inclusive whole economy growth strategy. Obviously, there's been a lot of rhetoric. I mean, the rhetoric on levelling up has been so successful that here we are with a panel, the title of which is the political slogan of one political party. Now that might be something that it needs some reflecting on, but that rhetoric has obviously caught the imagination of many people, because it does at least point towards a clear and obvious failing of our existing economic and political settlement. And clearly we do need to level up, but to really do that, it takes serious investment, it takes physical infrastructure, it takes social infrastructure of the sort that Sara's been talking about as well. It takes very kind of serious action if you really want to redistribute economic prospects and redistribute political power within the society. You have to make big changes, and I guess as to whether this is a now or never moment, I don't think so. I think COVID's opened our eyes to the possibility of there being very different ways of working, but it's also opened our eyes to some of the failings of the existing settlement, and to the way in which we haven't always valued what's most significant in our economy. So I think we'll be dealing with the consequences of this for a long time, and there might be a few chances to get it right.
Now, I'm conscious of time. We've only got a few minutes left, so I just wanted to end by asking all of you, what can we all do? What can individuals do? We've spent quite a lot of time talking about policies and politicians and institutions, but what can the individual do to help encourage this? Helen, maybe I'll come to you first.
Thanks very much. I think, there's a number of things we can do as individuals. One of the most important is vote. right? We do need a very different approach going forward, and actually stepping up, participating actively politically, getting the right people into positions who will actually make some of these decisions is going to be so critical. And again, I'm in the US at the moment. This is something that's so important and makes such a difference. So go out and vote. I think another one is to actually be vocal and ask for what you want to see. I mean, we were talking about investments. Where are you banking? Who are you investing in? How are you engaging in your communities? Where's your pension fund invested? Ask questions, make sure it's going to the right kind of economy, the care economy, a green infrastructure economy, a more inclusive economy. So we all have these different triggers we can do. But at the end of the day, there's things we can take as personal choices, but there's a lot more we can influence by the discussions we have, by the voting power, and how else we engage, because we do need governments, we need businesses, we need others to step up as well.
Sara, what would you say to our audience? What can they do?
Very much echoing what Helen has already said, being involved in politics, particularly local politics as well. So, contact your local MPs, contact your local councillors, make noise about the things that you really want to see happening. And I think this is particularly important. And I know this is kind of putting the onus on the individual when the barriers are very much structural, but it's particularly important for people from marginalized communities, women, so people who are not often at the decision-making table, to be heard and to make sure that their voices are heard, and again, particularly at the local level.
Joe?
Yeah, thanks. And I really appreciate the previous comments, especially the notion that we really have to be careful not to privatize these problems. I'm personally a passionate recycler. I do it as a sort of mode of being, but that isn't the answer to these big structural, as Sara said, and frankly, systemic problems that we're facing. And yet, the systemic scale of the problem can be disempowering, and it needn't be. And I think part of what Martin and I have been trying to talk about is these models of how you can actually get to work at the local level in the here and now. You don't have to wait for someone else to come and save you. You can prefigure what the future looks like. Of course, there's that wonderful quote from Margaret Mead: "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." And so I think we should take that as our motto and just get to work building the economy that we want to see in the future with the tools that we've got available, and then turn around and ask our political leaders why they're not enabling and advancing these real solutions that already exist. It's been great to be with you all.
Sign me up. Martin, what would you say?
I agree with everything that's been said before, but also say that if you take democracy seriously, democracy is a value that applies to institutions at different levels. So if you're someone working at a university, or working whatever your employer happens to be, if you're someone working in a bank or a hospital or whatever organization it might be, make sure that you're talking to the people in that organization about the role that that organization has in its community, and more broadly, what kind of an economic citizen it is, how it does its procurement, how it spends its money, how it interacts with the rest of its community. Because we have to be very serious about putting values into how all of our institutions work, and the same sorts of values that we would want to see being pursued by in local government or in national government. We should think about how all of the institutions that we're involved with can do similar sorts of good in the world as well.
A call to action for us all to know our influence and to use it. Okay, well, I just want to say a really big thank you to all of our speakers again, and thank you to you all for joining us. If you would like to purchase a copy of Pear's book, Tomorrow's Economy, A Guide to Creating Healthy Green Growth, signed copies will be available from our partner bookseller, Fox Lane Books. Martin and Joe's book, The Case for Community Wealth Building, is also available at most bookstores. We very much hope that you will continue to be engaged with the York Festival of Ideas, and you can check out the website for the full programme. Do continue the conversations online using the hashtag York Ideas. Please do revisit this event on our YouTube channel, and you may also be interested in catching up with the 2 other events in this series, Exploring Donut Economics and Levelling Up the Economy. I'd like to thank the Friends Provident Foundation for their support in the curation and presentation of these events. All that remains for me is to say a big thank you to you all for attending today and for your wonderful questions. Thank you and goodbye.